We're at war with the most dangerous enemy that has ever faced mankind in his long climb from the swamp to the stars. And it's been said if we lose that war, and in so doing lose this way of freedom of ours, history will record with the greatest astonishment that those who had the most to lose did the least to prevent its happening.
Arena Radio.
Now let's set the record straight. There's no argument over the choice between peace and war, but there's only one guaranteed way you can have peace, and you can have it in the next second. Surrender.
Obstructionism.
There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
Welcome to Arena Radio, the battlefield of ideas. My name is Chris Pilie with lanternsofliberty.us. It's been a pretty busy couple of weeks in the media. You know, obviously the Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman case has been more or less taking up a monopoly on the news cycle. And there's so many other things out there to cover. But I've been kind of watching. I've been debating people online about the whole issue of the specifics of the George Zimmerman trial. And I've decided that I was going to cover the trial a little differently than what you've been seeing in the media. Now, granted, the trial's over. George Zimmerman has been, the verdict was not guilty. And it has created a huge media storm and has brought out all the typical race baiters and the people in the political spectrum that always gain from these type of very controversial verdicts and court cases and so forth. And I'm not going to get into the details of the trial itself because I think that the trial, the merits there and the evidence there and the verdict are to speak for themselves. We don't have a perfect justice system, but the system that we have is the most perfect in all around the world. We don't have people getting hung in the streets and shot in the streets yet as a form of justice, as you see in many other countries around the world, specifically third world countries. But we do have a system that is fair, and it does lean towards the person being accused of whatever crime, and that's the way it should be. We hear so much throughout American history about being, innocent before, you have to be proven guilty. So the burden in the trial against George Zimmerman was on the prosecution. And the prosecution didn't have the evidence. And all that we know in this trial, all that we know is based on the evidence that has been provided to us by the prosecutions and the defense. So at the end of the day, the jury determined that George Zimmerman, based on the evidence, was not guilty. And regardless of that evidence and regardless of the verdict, there's many people out there that are just not satisfied with that. Some of them, they're not satisfied with it, and they're acting pretty civil, and they're talking about it, and which is fair enough. And there's many out there that see political gain from it. They feel like they can get some political capital by agitating the people that are emotionally distraught over the verdict. And that is probably, to me, the most telling and the most important part of the case to look at. And the reason why is because, based on reason, these type of crimes, or I shouldn't say crimes because it wasn't It wasn't seen as a crime. These type of incidents happen in our country every single day. The reason why this particular case became as big as it did was due to race. Now, what I want to do in this particular podcast is I want to go over basics. So if you're interested in the facts about racism, about our justice system, about history, this is going to be a podcast that I think you'll enjoy, and I think it's going to be enlightening. And believe me, through the process of researching for this specific podcast, it was very enlightening to me, and there were some things there that I learned that actually kind of made me realize that the way that I think our culture is not the case. And I'll do my best to try to emphasize that when those things come about in the research that I'm going to bring forward, so that way you can see how my mind evolved into the facts. The problem with our media is the media is biased. Overall, it's biased, and in a perfect world, we would not have a biased media. But we'll never have a perfect world, and we'll never have a media that's not biased. If we have a state-controlled media, like many in other countries, Soviet Union and the Chinese, they have a biased media, but they don't have both sides of the bias. And that is where we fail, if we go down that road. So my attacks on the media are simply what all of us as Americans should be doing. We shouldn't be favoring one media outlet for another media outlet. So for the Fox News and the NBC News crowd, you're going to be disappointed in what I have to say, because quite honestly, Fox News, MSNBC, they are biased. Now, we could obviously debate the level of bias, which there's really a hard way to gauge that. But the bottom line is, if you watch both of those media outlets, you are going to see a sense of bias. Part of the bias is based on culture. And I think that the biggest part of this particular case and other cases like this that do bring out the topic of racism are surrounded by this idea of culture, and specifically multiculturalism. So I do want to touch that and explain what my thoughts are on multiculturalism and how it actually affects. And interesting enough, if you go online and do a Google search, or if you go on YouTube and look up multiculturalism, you'll find a lot of people are talking about it, specifically in Britain. Believe it or not, Britain has a pretty profound issue right now with racism. And it's very hard to differentiate racism and discrimination, and sometimes they're coupled together. But in many cases, discrimination is actually based on culture, not based on race. Now, they do tend to work hand in hand, because many people of different races have certain cultures. If you go into a Latino household, you're going to see a different culture than if you're from a black household. You're going to see different cultures there. Nothing wrong with different cultures. Nothing wrong with embracing your culture. The problem is understanding and being open to other cultures in a way that is civil. And we're going to discuss a little bit of that. But what I want to start off with is, I want to put down or put away, I should say, the verdict, the Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman trial. I want to put down that whole trial, because to me, if you wish to, discover or embellish or be a part of that particular debate, there's a whole bunch of people talking about that particular case. The bottom line is the verdict is not guilty. The FBI has come out and said that there's nothing in the case or nothing in that whole scenario that actually showed that there was racism involved. And I'm simply going to leave it at that. And we're going to discuss the aftermath of the verdict and how our culture as Americans has become broken with all these different cultures that have a very tough time of communicating. And it all basically leads down to, where do we go and how do we manage it? So in starting, what I want to discuss is, some of the liberal bias out there and how the distortion of history is in display. And, I read tons of articles about the case. And the ones that were most interesting to me were the people that were utilizing history and evidence of how we as Americans are dealing with this particular issue. And, there was a lot of really good ones out there, and there was a lot of very poor ones. One of the ones that I found that was extremely interesting, and it kind of actually caught me off guard because it shocked me with the evidence that this person had. And it was an article in the New Yorker by Adam Gopnik. Now, if you're not familiar with Adam Gopnik, you can take a look at him on Google. He's got a lot of publications out there, and I found actually his article very compelling when I first read it. And of course, I'm in I guess tongue in cheek here, I discriminate everything that I read on the internet. I don't believe anything that I read on the internet when it comes to articles. I always take an article, I read it, and whether it makes me feel good or makes me feel bad, I always go do the research to try to see if what they're saying is true. And I've always found the New Yorker to be very biased, and I've found holes in it. But this one here actually, it actually spurred my thinking, made me think differently about our country. And then once I started to see through the veneer of his statement, I could see the true purpose of it. And there's actually another one that I'm going to read as well later from Robert Reich, which I do read him a lot. I respect him, but don't agree with just about anything he says. But I do respect him as an intellectual from the left. Same thing with Adam Gopnik. I haven't read a whole lot of his stuff. But anyway, so his article in the New Yorker is called Abraham Lincoln and the Birth of Stand Your Ground. And that right there, good writers always have good titles. And when I read that, I was like, wow, that ought to be interesting since I'm a lover of history. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to do my best to try to read at least most of this article. But I want you to pay attention to how Adam Gopnik takes our history and he tries to bring it to life in our day and age. And understand that what you're going to hear here is that the stand your ground law is within our culture, that American culture, that we are, forceful in being Americans. And he's bringing that forward in this article. And if most conservative intellectuals out there will know where this is going to go, but it's important to lay out this article in particular, and then I'm going to show the evidence of how it's actually false. So here we go. There is always the danger in a country of 300 million people that we will overgeneralize from the extreme example, only to find, in retrospect, that the extreme remained merely the extreme. The bad verdict in the O.J. Simpson trial did not make for an open season on ex-wives, nor must the apparent injustice of the case of George Zimmerman, acquitted after the shooting of Trayvon Martin dead, make for one on African-American teenagers in hoodies. But at least some of the factors driving the verdict, in particular, the stand your ground law in Florida, which I'm going to stop here, the ruling was not based on stand your ground. It was based on self-defense. And a lot of people have gotten this wrong. And I understand what he's doing here. He's basically bringing it to stand your ground to make his point, which to me, bring it to self-defense. Let's talk about the relevance here. But stand your ground was a factor, so I do agree with what he's saying here. But I think it's kind of interesting how he graduates the whole idea of the verdict and the injustice of that and brings it to stand your ground, which was not what it was ruled on. So, and I'll go back. So, but at least some of the factors driving the verdict, in particular the stand your ground law in Florida, don't seem seem extreme at all, in the sense of alien to the American scene. So there he is. He's saying, okay, this is part of our American scene, and it's not alien to that. and he's got in parentheses here, that the shooting happened in Florida, though, does seem to provide mordant further proof of my intuition that Florida is now where the theater of American violence plays out, as it once did in Los Angeles. Now, interesting enough here, this is me. Interesting enough, the violence didn't happen in Florida after this verdict. And this was on July 19th, so it's 4 days, or actually 5 days after the trial. So the violence actually happened in Los Angeles, and that we saw, and also I think San Francisco had some issues. You can look it up in the news. There was a lot of violence over there after the verdict. But I digress. One can start by pointing to a connection between two weird pieces of the whole horrible business. Okay, and he's got two things here. So first, why would anyone, as Zimmerman did, forge such an urgent sense of identity from his role as an armed make-believe policeman or neighborhood vigilante? An identity that led him, at a minimum, to walk around with a concealed handgun and take needless risks, like likely that end in tragedy. Okay, so that's his first point. Second is, and just as important, why does Florida allow men to carry guns so casually? Now, these are set up in a way. Basically, what he's doing here, he's setting up to make it seem, based on how he's writing this, that these are irregular, that these are not normal. Since the country's founding, people have carried guns. Now, granted, at the beginning of the founding, I imagine we didn't have many pistols around, and people putting pistols or handguns in their pockets, concealed and walking. In fact, people would go places with their rifle on the back of their horse or whatever. So they were common. Now with concealed carry, granted, I agree with concealed carry, they're not as common because you don't see them all the time. So he's playing on this, and it kind of goes into the narrative of the gun control debate that's going on. So basically, he's putting into context Zimmerman as a make-believe policeman, neighborhood vigilante. Now, I'm not going to dig too much into that, but if we understand that Zimmerman's neighborhood was experiencing a lot of crime, it was experiencing a lot of break-ins and a lot of theft, George Zimmerman took it upon himself, and not sure of the history of other people in his neighborhood doing the same, but took it upon himself to try to beat that. Obviously, the police weren't doing a very good job there, and I'm not saying anything bad about police, because police, for the most part, don't get to crimes in time. The crime happens, and then the police actually arrest people after the fact. Zimmerman was sick of it. He was out there trying to do this. Now, we can argue all day about whether he was racist or not. The facts, based on what the FBI looked at, didn't find anything there that was represented him being a racist. Anyway, I don't want to dig too far into that. That's a rabbit hole that's been going down too many times. And so basically, back to the article here. So how could stand your ground, which seems, after all, like an invitation to the kind of violence that laws and societies are meant to prevent, have evolved with such seeming nonchalance? So he goes further here. As it happens, about 20 years ago, I did a series of lectures at the New York Public Library on the romance of violence in American life. Well, you don't have to go far to see this. All you got to do is go to the movies, Mr. Gopnik, but I digress. I had come upon a body of 19th century common law practice that helped explain the evolution of America, or Americans' love of violence, and surprisingly revealed something about Abraham Lincoln's view of it. It began with a study of dueling in America. Dueling had largely died out in Europe by the middle of the 18th century, but it was revived in a self-consciously romantic manner in the 1780s. From there, it spread to England and then to America. Okay, so he goes further. In France and England, though, dueling was meant to reinstate an I always get this word wrong. Aristocratic code of honor against the encroachment of the middle class. So instantly he brings in the class aspect of it. Now keep in mind that back in the days of the British and French in the early 1700s or 17th century, I believe is what he's referencing here. There was a class society, but it was based on a monarchy. In fact, us as Americans left Europe to get away from that, to be able to be free. So I want to keep that in context as we read this here. So he goes further, and this is in parentheses. This is dramatized in the strange and wonderful Ridley Scott film, The Duelists. So if any of you want to see a good dueling movie, I guess that's a good one. But in the ideal European duel, it was likely that both parties would survive. In America, around the same time, the code of honor took a different form. American duels were dangerous, usually fought to the death. Now, I would think that any duel is dangerous, but anyway. And they left in their wake that special American thing, the feud. Instead of dissolving personal quarrels in a solvent of honor, the American way of dueling intensified them. In 1808, for instance, two men fought a duel in Maryland with rifles at 30 steps. During the Jackson administration, when General Armstead Thompson Mason challenged Colonel John Mason McCarty, it said, would only consent to meet him on such terms as would result in the certain destruction of both. On one or both. McCarty had suggested that they fight with pistols at point-blank range on top of a keg of gunpowder. In Europe, the honor of the duelist was a concept that that ennobled, he uses very, very phenomenal words here, and abstracted violence. In America, it was a concept that empowered and invigorated it. So he's explaining the culture, basically. He's explaining the culture of Britain at the time and how they were more passive than Americans. Americans were more aggressive. And he's starting to paint this picture, and very beautifully, mind you, that the American culture is a violent culture. Okay? So he goes further. This practice was fueled by a principle of common law. He's talking about the practice of the British, traced brilliantly by the historian Richard Brown in his book, No Duty to Retreat. In English common law, there was an old concept that if you were engaged in conflict and killed someone to prove self-defense, you had to demonstrate that your back was in most cases literally against the wall. So basically, you literally had to be against a wall in order to be able to prove self-defense. You had a duty to retreat. Okay? That was the British way. In America, the new concept was that you had no duty to retreat. Indeed, it was an obligation not to retreat. You were more or less required to blast away at anyone who approached and saw it. So basically, he's saying here, you had an obligation to be violent, is what he's putting here. And he uses some very colorful words, required to blast away. So, furthermore here, you didn't have to show that you had tried to escape the confrontation. In 1856, Texas law, Brown writes, gave private citizens wide discretionary powers to kill their fellow citizens legally and with impunity. Now, keep in mind, in 1856, at what time of American culture were we dealing with? And actually, he does go into this. Now, he comes at it from a different angle that, to me, is absent of true history. But 1856 is a pretty violent time in our country's history. So here we go. This violence-encouraging doctrine has persisted, and so too has the reasoning of the judicial decisions that established it. There is no invocation of natural law. So basically saying there is no natural law in this type of vigilantism. The argument isn't that all men have an inherent right to kill when threatened. The appeal is rather to a kind of implicit cultural law. It's not the American character retreat. So there he is, poking at it again, that we are as Americans don't retreat. Beneath the surface of the liberal state and the legal rules designed to limit violence and to grant a monopoly on its use to freely elected government, there is a national character that has to be protected, or perhaps invented, appealing to the shadow nation's impels the romance of violence in American life and give its practical and legal sanction as well. The legal liberal America is treated as a flimsy effigy, without the spirit to do the things that true Americans do. Above all, act violently with guns. And that identity is regarded as more worthy of protection of their citizenship. So, and we're going to continue on with this, and he's going to go on to Abraham Lincoln. But as you can see, is a very intellectual, very well-crafted liberal mind here. I mean, he is definitely making the case here for gun control, and more or less saying that our system of justice is based on violence. It's not based on passivity. And he more or less gives kudos to the old common law of the English. So, and it's funny because throughout this whole gun debate, we've seen Pierce Morgan come out and talk about the English and how if they would have won the Revolutionary War, that we wouldn't be having the issues that it's funny how this idea of European culture is seeping into our American debate. And it's funny that that there's characters out there like Pierce Morgan who are in fact have the English dialect that are fighting for this. And it's somewhat sickening how much people like Pierce Morgan, and I would say a little less in your face here, but Gopnik, hate the American way. And granted, I would say that somewhat of what Gopnik's saying here is true, because there was some vigilantism, but it was unlawful, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. Our culture was based on individual responsibility. And individual responsibility does include self-defense, and that is a vigilant effort. We have to be vigilant about protecting ourselves as well as protecting our property and our individual sovereignty. So let's go a little further, and this is where he starts getting to Abraham Lincoln. That's really what I want to focus in on. So he says, Abraham Lincoln discussed this romanticization of violence in 1838 in one of his earliest public speeches. And the speech name here was addressed before the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield, Illinois. What Lincoln asked threatened the well-being of American democracy. Only one thing, vigilante violence. So let me say that again. And this is what he's claiming here. What Lincoln asked threatened the well-being of American democracy? Actually, it was a question. I'm sorry. Only one thing, vigilante justice. So what he's saying here was that this speech was focused at vigilante justice, and it wasn't, going to hurt our democracy, or at least he was asking that question. The statement is that the vigilante justice aspect is what Lincoln was focused on. I would agree with that 100%, but the premise here is wrong. Okay, and we're going to actually listen to a little bit of Lincoln's speech, and I'll show exactly how it's completely 180 degrees out of phase from what Lincoln was referring to. But one of the things I think a lot of these liberals do have the benefit of is a lot of people read these and they don't actually go research like I do, and I'm sure other people do. There's a lot of people don't have the luxury of being able to go and research every single article they read, so they get the luxury of being able to say what they want and create their own history, like liberals are so great at doing. So back to what he says here. Only one thing, vigilante violence. the increasing disregard for law which pervades the country. So basically he's saying in the disregard to law. That's exactly what Abraham Lincoln was fighting against, was the disregard for law. The fact here is that Zimmerman was abiding by the law. It was lawful what he did. In fact, the ruling explained that. People don't like it, go change the law. That's another issue. Bottom line is, what he's saying here is in disregard for the facts of what he's talking about here in this stand your ground issue. Stand your ground is a law. So, furthermore, he detailed the epidemic of violence and then located its cause in the need for what we would now call identity politics. Constitutional institutions might be equitable, but they were lacking in, and it's striking that Lincoln would actually use this word, authenticity, the dry, rational legal system that the Revolution had ensured could never satisfy Americans' need for an emotional connection. Okay, I'm not going to read any further here. Actually, I'm going to read one more. Actually, we don't have much more left, but here we go. Lincoln's own call in response was for an ever more radical rationalization, and of course, the way that Kopnick says it's a radical rationalization, when in fact what Lincoln said, and he actually quotes it here: reason, cold, calculating, unimpassioned reason must furnish all the materials for our future support and defense. This was the doctrine underlying the Civil War, and it also makes clear Lincoln's readiness to go to war on behalf of what seemed to outsiders like a puzzling, arid legal principle, that the Union was not dissoluble. Okay, so I think that's as far as we need to go. But if you wanted to look up this article, you can go a little further. You just go to Google. It's pretty easy to find. Put in The New Yorker, Abraham Lincoln and the Birth of Stand Your Ground. Now, what I want to make sure we realize here is what he is saying here is that Lincoln was calling for a more rational way to deal with things out, that and basically do it in a way that wasn't full of passion. Now, in reference to stand your ground is not passion built. Even in the case of the Zimmerman trial, if we were to look at it in a stand your ground manner, the facts in the case, based on the evidence, was that Zimmerman was attacked by Trayvon Martin after Trayvon Martin was being followed. So basically, Trayvon Martin was being followed. Zimmerman was followed. Arguably, it was because he was trying to find out where he was based on the query from the 911 operator. The 911 operator is the one that said, where is he now? And Zimmerman went to go look. That's the argument. That's the basics in the case. So when Zimmerman couldn't find him, when he was going back to his car or was simply standing his ground, this is one of the reasons why some of the people were thinking that they were going to use this in the case. Trayvon Martin punched and broke George Zimmerman's nose. So at that point, based on the law, Zimmerman could have used stand your ground. So the passion here, we could say that Zimmerman was passionate about trying to be vigilant in his neighborhood. We could say that. But we could also say that Trayvon Martin was passionate based on the phone call that he had with Jantel. Jantel said that Trayvon said that it was a creepy-ass cracker. It kind of makes me laugh every time I hear about it. But based on what he's saying here is that he was impassioned about not being threatened by a gay guy. Now keep in mind, this is a black guy talking to his girlfriend. And they live in that culture, and that's fine. I can appreciate that. Pierce Morgan was trying to, take up for Jantel and that whole creepy ass cracker comment as a cultural issue, which fair enough. Okay, let's get past the funniness of that particular statement there. But Jantel, clearly said that he might be a rapist. So here's a guy on the phone with his girlfriend, a young guy, 17 years old. Feels, he's on his phone with his girlfriend. He probably is, trying to impress her in some way. And and I'm just making some speculations here. But here's a guy that gets impassioned enough to go and punch this guy in the nose for whatever reason. Now, some will argue that he was doing it in self-defense. And you don't punch somebody if you're afraid of something. You run away from it. You get away from it if you're afraid. So obviously here there was a different motivation. But the point I'm trying to get at here is, and I don't want to rehash the whole trial, was that what the guy from the New Yorker here is, Adam Gopnik is trying to get at, or trying to allude to, is that Abraham Lincoln was basically saying that we don't need this stand your ground. I mean, that's what he's saying, even in the title here. Abraham Lincoln and the birth of stand your ground. The birth of stand your ground to Adam Gopnik is the American Revolution, or the American culture. The American culture is stand your ground. Our whole nature is stand your ground. I would argue that some of it is. There's many other facets of American culture that we can talk about, and I'm not saying that Adam Gopnik here is missing that. The bottom line is the birth of stand your ground in the eyes of Adam Gopnik is the American culture. So, and he has apparently some disdain for the American culture because he believes that we should be acting in the English common law way, which is we should go to the far ends of the earth to not have to use force in order to protect themselves in a way that to me is irrational. So I understand that you don't want to use force in a way, but when somebody punches you in the nose, that is a clear act of violence that threatens your well-being. At that point, how much further do you have to wait in order to stand your ground and protect yourself in self-defense? Ask yourself that question. If anyone's listening to this that doesn't agree with what happened at that moment, think about you coming up to somebody or somebody coming up to you and that person starts to beat you. At that point, do you fear for your life or do you think it's a game? Do you have a rational way of mind? Do you think in a way that is, oh, well, he's only going to take one or two more punches? Do you know that? So the passion here that he's talking about, Adam Gopnik, what he's talking about is different than what this situation is. He's utilizing the energy behind this case in order to make a case against, one, the stand your ground law, American culture, and guns. Very beautifully written, very well composed. That's what he's getting to. But what I want to do is I want to go a little further with this. I want to listen to Abraham Lincoln's address, but I want to take a real quick break. And during the break, if you want, go to lanternsofliberty.us. Also, our new site is the battlefieldofideas.com. That one has the most recent information. We've been working pretty diligently to put as much information there. It's actually pretty neat because it really doesn't have so much of a conservative bias as Lanterns of Liberty does. I say bias. We're obviously conservative, so we generally look at things through conservative spectrum. Battlefield of Ideas, the intention there is to bring something to the table from both sides to allow people to debate on the battlefield of ideas. That's the intention, is to get people to talk. So we do reference a lot of the more biased media outlets out there because there are people that do look to that for their sole source of news. So we include things like Fox News, Media Matters, Think Progress, The American Thinker, Drudge Report, Huffington Post. Those are all polarized for the most part. So we do bring both sides of the argument there, and it's a good place to go ahead and get the discussions out there, because getting through this political climate and this, the place that we are, it's important to go into the battlefield of ideas with open eyes and open mind to other point of views out there, and that's what the battlefield of ideas is. So the battlefieldsofideas.com, go visit that. And also follow us on Twitter at Paul Revere again. Follow us there, and you can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Lanterns of Liberty. They are missing the point, and what's so amazing to me is these fools on television, they have spent their entire life making millions of dollars a year under the protection of the First Amendment. And they want to now, with that protection, take away somebody's right to the Second. You see how this all breaks down? Society breaks down with all this gibberish? Phony smiles? The phony smiles are what makes our society a civil one. We are the most civil society on the planet. Why? I would argue because of free enterprise. Now, the bigger the government gets, the less civil we get. The evidence is there. All you got to go do is look at the statistics. Look at the statistics that are more left-wing, big government, states, cities, to be specific, and look at the crime rate they have there. Why? Because people don't value property. Hell, I'm stealing from that guy over there. He's a rich dude. He's giving me free stuff. What's different from that than going and stealing something from my neighbor?
Arena Radio.
Check out Arena Radio on lanternsofliberty.us. Welcome back to Arena Radio, the battlefield of ideas. My name is Chris Pilie with lanternsofliberty.us. I want to go ahead and get right back into it. We've been talking about an article all surrounding the Stand Your Ground law in Florida and the George Zimmerman case. And an article in New Yorker written by Adam Gopnik where he basically makes a reference, the title is pretty much speaks for itself, Abraham Lincoln and the Birth of Stand Your Ground. And the whole idea that Adam Gopnik is bringing to the table here is that the American culture and its stand your ground nature, in other words, its protection of self, is what Adam Gopnik is trying to say is the problem here. Basically that the stand your ground issue, the violence that he sees in his eyes in the George Zimmerman Trayvon Martin altercation is a sense of false American ideals. In other words, the American way of protecting yourself and being vigilant, and the dueling that used to go on back in the early 17th century and the 18th century, that these were, perverted in American culture. And the American culture was radical and vigilante at nature. And in referencing Abraham Lincoln, he made some points that, to me, based on actual speech that Abraham Lincoln made, is false in nature. The premise is built on the wrong foundation. The speech that we're talking about is one that he did in Illinois. The name of the speech was the address before the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield, Illinois. And we're going to listen to some audio here. I think it's better to listen to a very articulate reader of this than for me to read it. When we're talking about Abraham Lincoln, by all means, I only wish that I had the oratory skills of Abraham Lincoln based on the way history has presented him. But I want to go ahead and listen to this. It's not too long, and I think it's very important for us to understand the context of Abraham Lincoln's speech, and then we're going to look at the contrast of what Adam Gopnik is trying to get at with the Abraham Lincoln, his reference here to stand your ground. So let's go ahead and take a quick listen here.
I'm Philip Gurevich. I'm going to read tonight the words of a Midwestern Republican to remind us all that sometimes to stand against all that we oppose most is done out of an absolutely passionate belief in the possibilities of government. Since I'm standing at the Lincoln podium tonight here, this is Abraham Lincoln's address before the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield, Illinois, on January 27, 1838, a fairly early speech. And the backdrop was that there had been a great deal. I had to cut a lot from the speech to fit it into the time. The backdrop was that there was a great deal of vigilantism in the country. Two particularly major incidents were much in the tabloids and the papers. The lynching of a murderer, a mulatto murderer in St. Louis, and in Mississippi, a series of lynchings that began, as he put it, with the hanging of gamblers, and from gamblers to Negroes, from Negroes to white citizens, and from these to strangers, till dead men were seen literally dangling from the boughs of trees upon every roadside, and in numbers almost sufficient to rival the native Spanish moss of the country as a drapery of the forest. This is Abraham Lincoln in Springfield, Illinois. As a subject for the remarks of the evening, the perpetuation of our political institutions is selected. In the great journal of things happening under the sun, we, the American people, find ourselves in the peaceful possession of the fairest portion of the earth as regards extent of territory, fertility of soil, and salubrity of climate. We find ourselves under the government of a system of political institutions conducing more essentially to the ends of civil and religious liberty than any of which the history of former times tells us. We, when mounting the stage of existence, found ourselves the legal inheritors of these fundamental blessings. We toiled not in the acquirement or establishment of them. They are a legacy bequeathed us by a once hardy, brave, and patriotic, but now lamented and departed race of ancestors. Theirs was the task, and nobly they performed it, to possess themselves and through themselves us of this goodly land, and to uprear upon its hills and its valleys a political edifice of liberty and equal rights. 'Tis ours only to transmit these to the latest generation. How then shall we perform this task? At what point shall we expect the approach of danger? By what means shall we fortify against it? Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step the ocean and crush us at a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined, with all the treasure of the earth, our own excepted, in their military chest, with a Bonaparte for a commander, could not by force take a drink from the Ohio or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. At what point, then, is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. I hope I am over-wary, but if I am not, there is, even now, something of ill omen amongst us. I mean, the increasing disregard for law which pervades the country, the growing disposition to substitute the wild and furious passions in lieu of the sober judgment of courts, and worse than savage mobs for the executive ministers of justice. When men take it in their heads today to hang gamblers or burn murderers, they should recollect that in the confusion usually attending such transactions, they will be as likely to hang or burn someone who is neither a gambler nor a murderer as one who is, and that acting upon the example they set, the mob of tomorrow may and probably will hang or burn some of them by the very same mistake. But all this even is not the full extent of the evil. By such examples, by instances of the perpetrators of such acts going unpunished, the lawless in spirit are encouraged to become lawless in practice, and having been used to no restraint but dread of punishment, they thus become absolutely unrestrained. Having ever regarded government as their deadliest bane, they make a jubilee of the suspension of its operations and pray for nothing so much as its total annihilation. But it may be asked, why suppose danger to our political institutions? Have we not preserved them for more than 50 years, and why may we not for 50 times as long? We hope there is no sufficient reason. But to conclude that no danger may ever arise would itself be extremely dangerous. That our government should have been maintained in its original form from its establishment until now is not much to be wondered at. It had many props to support it through that period, which now are decayed and crumbled away. Through that period, it was felt by all to be an undecided experiment. Now, it is understood to be a successful one. Then, all that sought celebrity and fame and distinction expected to find them in the success of that experiment. Their all was staked upon it. Their destiny was inseparably linked with it. Their ambition aspired to display before an admiring world a practical demonstration of the truth of a proposition which had hitherto been considered at best no better than problematical, namely, the capability of a people to govern themselves. If they succeeded, they were to be immortalized. Their names were to be transferred to counties and cities and rivers and mountains and to be revered in song and toasted through all time. If they failed, they were to be called knaves and fools and fanatics for a fleeting hour, then to sink and be forgotten. They succeeded. The experiment is successful, and thousands have won their deathless names in making it so. But the game is caught. And I believe it is true that with the catching ends the pleasure of the chase. This field of glory is harvested, and the crop is already appropriated. But new reapers will arise, and they too will seek a field. It is to deny what the history of the world tells us is true, to suppose that men of ambition and talents will not continue to spring up amongst us. And when they do, they will as naturally seek the gratification of their ruling passion as others have so done before them. The question, then, is can that gratification be found in supporting and maintaining an edifice that has been erected by others? Most certainly it cannot. Many great and good men, sufficiently qualified for any task they should undertake, may ever be found, whose ambition would aspire to nothing beyond a seat in Congress, a gubernatorial, or a presidential chair. But such belong not to the family of the lion or the tribe of the eagle. What? Think you these places would satisfy an Alexander, a Caesar, or a Napoleon? Never. Towering genius disdains a beaten path. It seeks regions hitherto unexplored. It sees no distinction in adding story to story upon the monuments of fame erected to the memory of others. It denies that it is glory enough to serve under any chief. It scorns to tread in the footsteps of any predecessor, however illustrious. It thirsts and burns for distinction, and if possible, it will have it, whether at the expense of emancipating slaves or enslaving freemen. It will require the people to be united with each other, attached to the government and laws, and generally intelligent to successfully frustrate such designs. Here, then, is a probable case, highly dangerous, and such a one as could not have well existed heretofore. Passion has helped us, but can do so no more. It will be in future our enemy. Reason, cold, calculating, unimpassioned reason, must furnish all the materials for our future support and defense. Let those materials be molded into general intelligence, sound morality, and in particular a reverence for the Constitution and laws. Upon these let the proud fabric of freedom rest as the rock of its basis. And as truly has been, and as has been said of the only greater institution, the gates of hell shall not prevail against it.
Okay, so in context, Abraham Lincoln is at a time when, or speaking at a time when slavery was obviously extremely highly political, energy. There's an energy there, and he was fighting against it, as our founders did. Many of our founders did since the beginning of our country. And I think it's very important here to mention, and I definitely want to mention this particular speech, but in context to what Abraham Lincoln is saying, not what the guy from the New Yorker is saying, but what Abraham Lincoln here is recognizing, that our founders put together a fabulous system. A system that was incredible. And what he's looking for is the rule of law. He's looking for Americans to look at other Americans through the eyes of justice of the law, not through passion and through vigilantism. So that to me is profound in a way that I believe that most of our founders looked at our country. Abraham Lincoln was saying some pretty profound things here, given the time. But our founders never steered from the rule of law. And I believe that most well-rounded Americans in this day and age are the same way. Now, we can debate all day whether or not a law is a reasonable law or not, but the fact of the matter is, based on the Trayvon Martin case, the law was stand your ground. We do have a responsibility to protect ourselves. So, which brings in, the New Yorker story. And first I have to mention this, because as I listened to this speech, my discriminatory nature of things that I get off of the internet, I decided to print the address before the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield, Illinois. And interestingly enough, the guy that was reading here, and I don't have the guy's name because I probably should have got his name, but it's not, to me, is not as important as the speech itself. That was the whole reason. I wasn't trying to get this guy's opinion on it. But interesting enough, he left out some key parts to the speech. And he said up front that due to time, now keep in mind, this is a little over an 8-minute period of time. So I don't know what format he was using here, but 8 minutes to leave out a couple of sentences in this whole entire thing here, to me is a little bit dishonest and disingenuous. The part of the speech that he left out, actually there was two that I want to mention here, was in the very, very beginning. He read, if in the great journal of things happening under the sun, we, the American people, and he jumps past this whole next part of the sentence. He skips, find our account running order date of the 19th century of the Christian era. How interesting. That he basically totally eliminated Christianity from the speech. Now, did he do that at a time, or did he do that because he's a liberal professor and he didn't want to mention Christianity for the sake of being, to eliminate state and religion or whatever? I don't know. But the bottom line is he skipped that part of his speech. Another thing that he skipped was the task of gratitude to our fathers, justice to ourselves, duty to prosperity, and the love for our species in general, all imperatively require use faithful to perform. So he's eliminating religion. I mean, come on. Do we have to forge history when referencing it in order to get across an agenda? So I just thought that was pretty profound that we did find that this guy, I have to go through 3 different places to find what actually truly was said, because we've misrepresented history in a progressive manner to get across an agenda. So I digress. So we go a little further here. One of the things that I want to point out is Abraham Lincoln. He said, as a country, as Americans, and I quote here from the speech, shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step the ocean and crush us at a blow? And he says, never. And of course, the transcript of the speech says never with an exclamation point. So never not stand your ground. Never allow yourself to retreat. That's what he's saying here. So in context, the New Yorker, Abraham Lincoln, was not saying to not stand your ground. So Adam Gopnik is disingenuous in his idea that based on Abraham Lincoln, that Abraham Lincoln was saying that we should not be acting on our American ideals of protecting ourselves, self-defense, being vigilant to protect ourselves. What Abraham Lincoln was speaking about here was some pretty violent stuff that was going on. One in particular he talks about, and in the speech he says, thus went on this process of hanging from gamblers to Negroes, from Negroes to white citizens, and from these to strangers, till dead men were seen literally dangling from the boughs of trees upon every roadside, in the numbers almost sufficient to rival the native Spanish moss of the country as drapery of the forest. So basically riding down the road and seeing people hanging on the side of roads as if it was just moss on trees. So Abraham Lincoln here is talking about unlawful vigilantism, not lawful vigilantism. That is what's important to take from this. And it's important to look at the fact that our liberal media is specifically, misrepresenting the true facts of our country's history. But why? Because they have a true belief, for whatever reason, many reasons I'm sure, but they have a belief that if we just eliminate guns, that we will eliminate violence. It's all built on these false premises. All of their premises are false to try to push forward an agenda. And they're all to back this left-wing president and the people that are involved with him trying to eliminate guns from our culture. It's false. And what's so sad is they will utilize the whole thing that's going on with the Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman case. They will use that as a way to push a political agenda. And it's really sad. So, I think it's what we need to do here is we're going to take another break. And when we come back, I'm going to go over a little more of this, and then I have some really good statistics to go over, as well as a view from one of my favorite African-American political geniuses, and he's not a politician by any means. I say political genius. He's just a genius in general, Thomas Sowell. So we'll be back with the Battlefield of Ideas. Be sure to visit the battlefieldofideas.com. Real easy to sign up there. All you got to do is click the Twitter, join with Twitter link, and if you have a Twitter account, it will automatically log you in simply, and you can comment on any of the posts that we have there. So visit the battlefieldofideas.com from Lanterns of Liberty, and we'll be back.
If it becomes wayward, who shall control it? If it becomes unjust, who shall trust it? As sentinels of the country's watchtower, I beseech you to watch and guard with sleepless dread that corporation which can make all property and rights, all states and people, and all liberty and hope its playthings in an hour and its victims forever.
Arena Radio.
Check out Arena Radio on lanternsofliberty.us.